Welcome, Internet, to Psychoanalytic Talk, and today we're going to be talking about sublimation. Sublimation is one of my favorite concepts, as it is one of those defense mechanisms that show that it's both useful and necessary to have them. That it's not, defense mechanisms are not just a hindrance, but they are also an elevation. So what is sublimation? Well, very simply, sublimation is the action that the mind has to transform drives that are morally and in terms of the ego unacceptable, and instead of repressing the energy, pushing it further away within the unconscious mind, what's going to happen is that that energy is going to be used and transformed. It's going to be transformed into socially acceptable outlets. One of the main outlets when we talk about sublimation is art, right? It can be music, painting, sculpture, video essays on YouTube, you name it. But that's fundamentally sublimation for you. It's this act of transformation of one raw element, namely the drives, to something much more sophisticated, which is art. And sublimation is a pathway from one to the other. So it's one of my favorite concepts because fundamentally it shows that defense mechanisms are something that are beautiful. Because often when we talk about defense mechanisms, we have that idea that it's something that just impedes the individual in his life, and that there's something that was good at a certain point in life, but now they're wrong, or they're bad, or they're evil. Whereas, in truth, defense mechanisms are very useful and important for the mind, as those are the ways the mind copes with everything that is happening. And sublimation is the most beautiful example of how the mind can cope by creating something, making something out of the drives. That the drives are not like a death sentence of on human nature. They are a factor that can be changed. And that's what I like so much about it, is that it gives a fundamental hope to humanity, that humanity can do something of their drives, that we are not bound to destruction or endless pleasure principle. We can make something out of it, which is fundamentally great. It's also very interesting to note that sublimation implies something very interesting. It implies that the ego is strong enough to be able to maintain it and to be able to use the drives without foregoing its responsibility. What I mean by that is that the ego is stable enough to maintain the drives and to defer, meaning to reject or to delay gratification, meaning that it gives enough time for something else to come into the frame. And that's something that I found very interesting. It's also interesting to note that in this sublimation, it's often a very good superego appeasement, because the superego is very happy and satisfied with sublimation, as sublimation answers both the ego and the superego's needs for something else, something that goes beyond criticism or moral values, something that transcends the simple individual, because it's also about connection, and arts and creation can connect a person to another, or even, as we've seen, fragments of the person to each other. For example, the ego and the superego connect to each other in this process of sublimation to create something new, which is going to calm the superego and allow the ego to thrive in a way that's much more fundamental. It's also very interesting to note that from a Kleinian perspective, sublimation is also an act of reparation. It's after the threat of the destructive object or the bad object, one sublimates, transforms that bad object into something relatively good. It's in a way an appeasement of the dynamic bad object, good object into something else. which is very interesting to me. It's also very, very worthwhile noting that Freud did not quite well define sublimation. Like, he gave like the general outlook on it, but he didn't like go into minute details, which means that there might be some level of like confusion or uncertainty. For example, what differentiates sublimation from reactional formation? It seems to me quite evident, at least to me personally, that sublimation is an act of fundamental transformation that doesn't involve repression, but on the contrary, modification, whereas reactional formation is not transformation, it's repression that comes so hard that it changes the dynamic. This is not the case with sublimation. Sublimation is like molding clay, at least in my mind. It's like molding clay. You're making something out of it. Whereas for reactional formation is like pushing it out, and it comes back straight onto you, and then you start fearing that it might come back, so you push it even further. Whereas sublimation is, as I said, something completely different. What I also like fundamentally about this is that it gives a connectiveness to Freud's theories, meaning that it's not all wrong or it's not all bad. It's some beautiful and complex and nuanced talk about all of this, that sublimation is as important as anything else. And it's something that we are not always able to use, or because of anxiety or because of anger, but it's still a potential that drives us and allows us to make something out of ourselves and of the external world. I would even go so far as to say it's a way of mediation between our drives and the external world, in between relationships because of the internalized moments of the good and bad object, and ourselves. So it's so many things, and it's things that are so essential to our humanity in this concept that I found it to be very important and a driving force into what can be accomplished in therapy. As often when patients start to create, to have an outburst of creativity, of drives, of will to do stuff, and start to create, you know that you have achieved something as a therapist, as creation often leads to something that's very powerful in the mind of the patient, of both an agency, but also of a form of self-understanding, because that creation also is a sort of self-understanding. So through sublimation there is agency and self-love and self-understanding. Well, maybe self-love is, I'm pushing it a bit, but you get the idea. There is something of ourselves to ourselves that's not destructive, not aggressive, and not purely sexual. Because that's another thing with Freud, is that for him, it's also a way of desexualizing what should be sexualized. Because as all of you know, Freud's theory rests upon this very idea that sexuality is at the core of everything, and not adult sexuality, like unconscious pregenital sexuality. And sublimation is a way of handling all of that in an elegant and civilized way, which is very true, but it's not just that. It's also, I think, the bedrock of our humanity. Well, that was pretty much it for me. If you have any questions or anything you want to add, please feel free to do so in the comments. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.